In November of 1718, a British naval lieutenant sailed into a North Carolina inlet with 2 hired sloops, 60 privately paid men, and no legal authority to be there. He flew no flag on approach. He hid his guns below deck. He used deception to close the distance on an anchored vessel before opening fire. When the battle ended, and it ended quickly, savagely, he cut off the head of the man he had come to kill, mounted it on the bowsprit of his ship, and sailed back to Virginia like a man who had done something worth celebrating. His name was Robert Maynard. The man whose head now hung from the bow was Edward Teach, known to history as Blackbeard, and the story that followed, the one printed in pamphlets, repeated in taverns, eventually recorded by a writer named Charles Johnson in what became the definitive account of the Golden Age of Piracy, was the story of civilization defeating a monster. That story was not accidental. It was engineered. And the engineering tells you more about the British Empire than the monster ever could. Because what Maynard actually killed that morning was not a bloodthirsty demon who had terrorized the Atlantic. What he killed was a man with roughly 15 crew members, anchored quietly in a shallow inlet, who had not attacked a single vessel in the surrounding waters. What he killed was a man who, and this detail cuts through everything, would have been legally pardoned within weeks. A second royal amnesty was already sailing toward Virginia when Blackbeard died. It arrived in December. It would have covered him. His own quartermaster, William Howard, was saved from the gallows the very day that pardon reached shore. The state killed a man for crimes it had simultaneously decided to forgive, and then it mounted his head on a spike and called it justice. To understand how that becomes possible, how a government can execute and pardon the same man in the same month without either act being accidental, you have to understand what Blackbeard actually was and what forces actually needed him dead. Not the pirates, not the evil, the forces, the interests. The political calculations operating at a level so far above one bearded man in a Carolina inlet that he probably never fully understood the game he was caught inside. It begins as most things in this story begin, with a war ending. The War of the Spanish Succession ran from 1701 to 1714. For 13 years, the British state had paid, trained, and deployed thousands of men to fight across European theaters and Atlantic shipping lanes. Privateers, legally licensed pirates, which is the accurate description, raided enemy commerce with royal blessing. Naval veterans learned the exact mechanics of seizing ships at sea, how to approach from windward, how to read a crew's willingness to resist, how to select targets and consolidate prizes. The state taught them all of this. It needed them to know. Then the Treaty of Utrecht arrived, and the state stopped paying. The demobilization was not gradual. It was not managed. It was an abrupt mass discharge of trained maritime combatants into Atlantic port cities, Bristol, Portsmouth, Newport, Nassau, Port Royal, at precisely the moment when legal maritime employment could not absorb them. Merchant wages had collapsed. Naval service offered terrible conditions and no prize money in peacetime. What these men had been trained to do, the thing they were genuinely skilled at, was now criminal. The commission had vanished. The behavior remained. This is the foundation of the Golden Age of Piracy, and it is not romantic. It is a labor crisis with a nautical accent. A government produced a surplus of violent maritime specialists, discarded them without transition, and expressed shock when they continued practicing their trade without authorization. The surprise was performed. The outcome was predictable. Anyone paying attention to the port reports in 1714 and 1715 could see what was coming. Some people were paying attention. They simply calculated that ignoring the problem was cheaper than addressing it. The men who drifted toward Nassau in those early years were not outlaws by nature. They were tradesmen whose trade had been reclassified. Nassau, New Providence in the Bahamas, had been abandoned by its legal owners, the Lords Proprietors, after repeated enemy raids during the war. No garrison, no governor worth the name, no court, no revenue, just a harbor, a town, and several hundred people living without what one Bermuda official described as any face or form of government. Into that vacuum came the men whom Utrecht had displaced, and what they built there was not chaos exactly. It was an alternative economy, a counter-society. Ships came and went. Prizes were divided. Goods were sold. A man named Benjamin Hornigold effectively ran the place, and under Hornigold, a younger man named Edward Teach learned his trade. What is striking about this period is not the violence. It is how little violence there was. Pirates in Nassau were not slaughtering crews. They were operating a commercial enterprise that happened to involve unauthorized seizure of cargo. Most merchant ships surrendered without a fight when approached by a vessel that outnumbered them. The logic was simple on both sides. Surrender preserves the cargo, preserves the crew, and avoids bloodshed. Resistance risks everything. The pirates preferred intact prizes and living witnesses. Killing was expensive in time, resources, and reputation. A pirate captain who murdered crews would find no one willing to surrender peaceably, which meant every capture would become a battle. Blackbeard understood this better than almost anyone. He never killed a man during his entire career, not until the final battle at Ocracoke, where he had no choice. Every documented interaction with captured crews shows the same pattern: controlled theater, overwhelming display of force, rapid surrender, distribution of goods, sometimes the release of the ship itself. He once held Charleston Harbor hostage for days, capturing vessels entering and leaving, holding passengers and crew aboard. His demand was not gold, it was a chest of medicine. He received it, released everyone unharmed, and sailed away. That is not the behavior of a monster. That is the behavior of a man who had mastered the psychology of intimidation and understood precisely how much performance he needed to produce compliance. The slow-burning fuses he wove into his braided beard, the ones that made smoke curl around his face in combat, were not insanity, they were calculated. Sailors in the early 18th century were deeply superstitious. The Atlantic was enormous and poorly charted and full of things that killed you without warning. A man who appeared out of sea fog looking like he was literally on fire, wreathed in smoke, carrying 6 pistols and multiple blades, dressed in black, screaming incomprehensible profanity. That man would not need to fire a single shot to empty the deck of most merchant crews. The theater was the weapon. Blackbeard had built a character so effective that ships surrendered to his reputation before he even came within cannon range. He was performing. But here is the thing about performance, so was everyone else. Consider Jamaican Governor Archibald Hamilton, who in 1715 authorized privateers to salvage a Spanish treasure fleet that had wrecked off Florida. The authorization was technically legal, salvage rights existed, and the wrecks were recent. But the men Hamilton sent knew exactly what they were doing, and so did he. Henry Jennings and his crew used their official salvage paperwork as cover for outright theft from Spanish recovery operations. Benjamin Hornigold was involved. Edward Teach, quite possibly, was nearby. The wrecking expeditions of 1715 and 1716 are where the Nassau Pirate Republic truly crystallized. Not from some spontaneous outbreak of criminality, but from colonial governors deliberately blurring the legal line between authorized recovery and predation because it served their immediate economic interests. When a governor hands men a commission to do what is functionally piracy and then expresses horror when those men continue doing it without the commission, the horror is theatrical. The governor understood the outcome. He simply needed the paperwork to maintain plausible distance. This is the pattern that runs through everything. Legal categories functioning as political instruments, deployed or withdrawn, depending on what the state needed at any given moment. Privateer and pirate were not descriptions of different behaviors. They were descriptions of different relationships to state authorization. The same man, using the same ship, employing the same tactics, raiding the same kinds of vessels. He was a patriot one year and a criminal the next. What changed was not what he did, What changed was whether someone in a government office had signed a document blessing the activity. Blackbeard's famous ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. The name itself lives in this ambiguity. Queen Anne was the monarch under whom most of these men had privateered. Her reign had authorized their violence. By invoking her name on a vessel operating outside that authorization, Teach was either gesturing at irony or simply acknowledging that the line between her service and his current work was thinner than anyone in London wanted to admit. By 1717, the Nassau situation had become impossible to ignore. The South Sea Company had absorbed an enormous quantity of public debt and held monopoly rights over specific Atlantic trade routes. The East India Company's cargo was moving through waters where pirates were increasingly bold. Bristol merchants were losing ships. These were not humanitarian concerns driving metropolitan policy. They were profit concerns. Specific capital interests lobbied specific officials, and the government responded, as it tends to whoever was loudest and wealthiest. The response was a royal pardon. King George I's Act of Grace, offered in 1717, promised forgiveness to any pirate who surrendered before January 5, 1718. The instrument was elegant in its ambition and hollow in its execution. There were no employment programs attached to it. No naval positions waiting, no land grants, no resettlement assistance, no economic alternative to the life these men had been living. The pardon was a legal document without a social framework. It told men to stop being pirates without creating any meaningful way for them to be something else. Stede Bonnet accepted the pardon and was back at sea within months. Many others did the same. The underlying pressure, poverty, displacement, the impossibility of legitimate maritime wages competing with prize shares had not changed. The state offered forgiveness without addressing the conditions that had made forgiveness necessary. It then expressed frustration when the symptom returned, as if a doctor who refused to treat an infection could be surprised by its recurrence. Blackbeard accepted a pardon from North Carolina Governor Charles Eden in the summer of 1718. He settled in Bath, the colony's small, underdeveloped capital. He married a local woman. He bought property, frequented the taverns, played the part of a reformed man with what contemporaries described as considerable social ease. He was good at performance. He had always been good at performance. But Bath, North Carolina in 1718 was a specific place with specific limitations. It was poor. The colony had no navy, no garrison, no consistent revenue source, and governance so fragile that it depended substantially on trade, including, increasingly, trade with Blackbeard. The goods that moved through his hands were priced below market rates. In an impoverished colony, where imported goods were expensive and scarce, a man who could supply sugar, cocoa, fabric, and tools at dramatically reduced prices was not a threat to the local economy. He was its informal engine. Governor Eden understood this with the clarity that comes from governing a place that nobody in London actually cared about protecting. The Lords Proprietors, the distant English aristocrats who technically owned North Carolina, had demonstrated their commitment to the colony most vividly during the Tuscarora War of 1711, when indigenous attacks devastated settlements and the proprietors provided essentially nothing in the way of military or financial support. Eden governed without troops, without reliable courts, and without funds. When Blackbeard arrived with a fleet and a trading network, the calculus was not complicated. What followed was not corruption in the dramatic sense. It was adaptation in the institutional sense, which is often how corruption actually looks from the inside. Eden granted Blackbeard and his crew pardons of questionable legal validity, since several of them had committed piracy after the original January 1718 cutoff date. Eden then convened Vice Admiralty court proceedings that declared Blackbeard's captured French cargo to be abandoned salvage, legally awarding portions of it to the pirate, to the court, and to Tobias Knight, the colony's chief justice and customs collector, who received his share in the form of personal gifts, sugar, chocolate, goods from the hold. Everyone involved knew the ship was not abandoned. The legal fiction was necessary. The economy required the unofficial market that pirates supplied, and the official courts provided the paperwork that laundered the transaction into legitimacy. Knight appears in the records as a mild, bureaucratic figure. Not a villain, not a schemer, but a colonial administrator doing what colonial administrators did when the formal economy couldn't sustain the colony and the informal one could. He accepted gifts. He signed documents. He was, in the language of his era, accommodating. In the language of ours, he was an accessory to piracy under statutes that carried the death penalty. The distinction between those two descriptions is where the moral texture of this entire episode lives. The court records that documented these arrangements, the pardons, the admiralty findings, the goods, the gifts, became, once they existed, extraordinarily dangerous. Not to Blackbeard, to Eden, to Knight, to the proprietary government of North Carolina itself. Because if those documents ever reached the right hands, they didn't just implicate a governor, they implicated the governance structure. They proved that North Carolina's proprietary administration was not merely unable to suppress piracy, it was actively, documentably complicit in it. And in North Carolina in 1718, there were men who very much wanted to prove exactly that. Edward Moseley and Morris Moore were the colony's most ambitious planters, and they had spent years working toward a specific political goal: the dissolution of North Carolina's proprietary charter and its conversion to a royal colony. The Lords Proprietors had failed the colony repeatedly, during the Tuscarora War, during the pirate years, during every crisis that required actual resources and actual governance. Royal control, these men believed, would bring crown funding, crown military protection, and crown courts that actually functioned. Their project was constitutional, not personal, but constitutional projects need evidence. They need demonstrable failure. They need a moment when the gap between what the proprietors promised and what they delivered becomes undeniable. Blackbeard, sitting in Bath with his ships and his fraudulent pardons and his gifts of chocolate to the Chief Justice, was exactly the evidence they needed. They contacted Alexander Spotswood. Spotswood was Virginia's lieutenant governor, a royal governor, appointed by the Crown, governing a Crown colony that bordered the proprietary mess of North Carolina to the south. He was an ambitious, intelligent man with a clear view of his own political interests, and those interests aligned almost perfectly with the anti-proprietary faction's agenda. A royal governor surrounded by proprietary weakness was a royal governor whose influence was artificially constrained. If North Carolina became a royal colony, the balance of Atlantic power shifted. If Spotswood could be the man who proved proprietary governance had failed, dramatically, publicly, with the pirate's head as Exhibit A, his own standing in London improved considerably. The affidavit he received from a North Carolina trader, alleging that Blackbeard was fortifying Ocracoke Inlet and planning a new pirate republic, gave him his pretext. The allegation was almost certainly fabricated, or at least dramatically inflated. Blackbeard had 15 men at Ocracoke. 15. He was not building fortifications. He was not threatening regional trade. He was sitting in a shallow inlet, probably drinking, nowhere near the main shipping lanes. The Ocracoke threat that Spotswood described in his dispatches to the Board of Trade was a political document masquerading as an intelligence report. Spotswood dispatched Maynard anyway. He had to do it privately because he had no legal authority to send armed forces into a neighboring colony without that colony's governor requesting it. And Eden, obviously, had not asked for help. The Royal Navy vessels available were too large for North Carolina's shallow inshore waters, so Spotswood hired civilian sloops. He paid out of his own pocket. He offered a bounty, £100 for Blackbeard dead or alive, to motivate men who had no particular ideological investment in the outcome. The sailors who made the journey were, in terms of their incentive structure, not fundamentally different from the pirates they went to kill. They were going for the money. Maynard approached Ocracoke on the night of November 21st, 1718, anchoring to wait for light. He flew no flag. He hid his guns. He used the dawn to close distance before his presence was clear. These are pirate tactics. They are effective tactics, which is why pirates use them, but they were employed here by a British naval officer, conducting an operation that was itself outside any recognized legal framework. The expedition to kill Blackbeard was, by its own operational logic, a pirate raid authorized by a governor rather than a crown. The battle itself was short and brutal in the way that violence at close quarters always is. Blackbeard had 15 men and 2 vessels against Maynard's 60 and 2 sloops. He fought with what witnesses described as extraordinary ferocity, shot 5 times, slashed across the neck and body repeatedly before he finally fell. The accounts, most of them written after the fact and shaped by political need, insist he died still swinging. Whether that is literal or metaphorical barely matters. What matters is that he died, and within hours Maynard had separated his head from his body and hung it from the bow. That image, the head on the bowsprit, carried a specific message, and the message was not addressed to pirates. Pirates already knew what happened to men who were caught. The message was addressed to merchants, to colonial elites, to the Board of Trade in London, to the Lords Proprietors and their critics alike. It said, "The Empire is in control. The Empire can project force. The Empire defeats its monsters." The problem is that almost none of the surrounding facts supported that story. Maynard returned to Virginia to find himself accused by his own commanding officer of misappropriating the seized pirate goods and promoting himself to a higher command rank to claim a larger share of any prize money. The man who killed Blackbeard was, by the standards of his own naval peers, acting with the self-interested opportunism of the people he had just eliminated. He received no promotion for 21 years. His official commendation was, to use the period language that contemporaries actually deployed, notable for its absence. The anti-proprietary factions' attempt to seize Eden's documents, the Admiralty Court records, the pardons, the evidence of Knight's gifts, failed almost completely. Mosley and Moore broke into Knight's office and found the papers, but the legal consequences were immediate. They were fined for breaking and entering, the documents were returned, and the coup they had engineered through Blackbeard's death produced nothing usable in the short term. North Carolina remained a proprietary colony for another 10 years. The constitutional struggle they had fought through this entire violent episode ended in a procedural draw. Tobias Knight died of illness before he could be formally prosecuted. Eden survived the political fallout. Spotswood was eventually censured, not for the illegal invasion of a neighboring colony, but because a Virginia grand jury noted that the circumstances of Blackbeard's death would make little for his reputation. A rebuke, not a reckoning. The men who had broken colonial law to manufacture a pirate hunt escaped meaningful consequence, because consequence requires institutions willing to apply it, and the institutions in question had too much invested in the outcome to scrutinize the method. And then there is the pardon. The second pardon, the more generous one, sailing toward Virginia even as Maynard made his approach on Ocracoke. It arrived in December. It would have covered Blackbeard. The state was simultaneously executing a man and preparing to forgive him. And neither act was coordinated with the other, because the Empire's left hand and right hand operated in different oceans on different timetables, serving different interests. The pardon came from London, from the metropolitan center responding to general policy pressure. The execution came from Virginia, from a royal governor responding to local political opportunity. Both were genuine expressions of imperial power. They simply contradicted each other completely. This is the detail that clarifies everything else. The British Empire did not have a policy toward Blackbeard. It had competing interests, competing authorities, and competing timelines that happened to intersect in a Carolina inlet in November 1718. One interest arrived 6 weeks too early. The other arrived 6 weeks too late. A man died in the gap between them. The myth that filled that gap, the monster with the smoking beard, the demon of the Atlantic, the bloodthirsty scourge, served the Empire's needs precisely because it was simple. Institutional failure is not simple. Explaining that piracy emerged from naval demobilization, colonial underfunding, jurisdictional incoherence, mercantile lobbying, and proprietary neglect is not a story anyone can put on a pamphlet. Explaining that Blackbeard was killed by a privately funded illegal cross-border raid motivated by constitutional politics and personal ambition, and that he would have been pardoned had he survived 6 more weeks, requires a kind of honesty about imperial governance that empires are structurally disinclined to produce. But a monster is clean, a monster is useful. A monster concentrates all of the ambient anxiety, the displaced sailors, the collapsing colonial order, the porous courts, the governors taking gifts of chocolate from men they were legally obligated to hang, and transforms it into a single figure who can be killed and mounted on a bow and pointed at as proof that the problem has been solved. The problem, of course, had not been solved. The problem was built into the colonial project itself. The same trade routes that made piracy profitable were the ones that made colonial labor disposable. The same mercantile lobbying that pushed for anti-piracy campaigns was the same interest structure that had pushed for the privateering commissions that trained the pirates. The same empire that hanged men for seizing cargo had spent a decade paying men to seize cargo and calling it patriotism. The headless body of Edward Teach floating in Pamlico Sound was not the end of that contradiction. It was a performance of its resolution. Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, cemented the myth that Spotswood's reports had begun. Johnson, whoever Johnson actually was, gave Blackbeard his literary immortality, and that immortality required a particular shape: the demon who lit himself fire, who drank gunpowder in rum, who married 14 times, who descended into battle roaring like something from below the waterline. Whether any of these details are true matters less than what they accomplish. They make Blackbeard's death feel like an inevitability, like the rightful conclusion to a career of pure evil, like a story that ends the only way stories about monsters can end. What the story cannot accommodate is the pardon sailing into Virginia Harbor in December. What it cannot accommodate is 15 men anchored in a quiet inlet. What it cannot accommodate is the fraudulent Admiralty Court, the illegal expedition, the privately paid sailors motivated by treasure, the constitutional struggle that had nothing to do with maritime security, the governor who bribed himself with chocolate and called it salvage. What it cannot accommodate is a man who, in the entirety of his career, has no documented murder to his name until the moment someone came to kill him. The real Blackbeard was less frightening than the myth. That's not a judgment in his favor. He was, by any reasonable accounting, a criminal operating outside legal boundaries in ways that had genuine consequences for the people whose ships he seized and held hostage. But the gap between what he actually was and what the myth requires him to be is the most important space in this entire story, because that gap is where the Empire hides. In that gap, you find the discharged sailors starving in Bristol. You find the abandoned colonists on New Providence building their own order because the proprietors had vanished. You find Governor Eden signing documents he knows are worthless because the alternative is watching his colony collapse. You find Tobias Knight accepting sugar because the formal economy of North Carolina cannot pay him a living wage. You find Spotswood paying for an illegal war out of his own pocket because the legal route would have taken months and served someone else's agenda. You find the pardon, the head, and the pardon arriving in the same month, the same harbor 6 weeks apart. The Empire needed Blackbeard to be a monster because monsters are the explanation that lets institutions off the hook. If the piracy crisis was caused by a moral failure, by individual men choosing evil over righteousness, then the solution is moral restoration. Catch the monsters, hang the monsters, mount the heads. Order is restored. The Empire is competent. The system works. If the crisis was caused by a structural failure, by demobilization without transition, colonial governance without resources, legal categories deployed as political instruments, mercantile interests driving enforcement and withdrawing it according to profit, then the solution is reform. Reform is expensive. Reform requires acknowledging that the empire's own design produced the crisis. Reform requires powerful people to admit that their power operated corruptly, at scale, over decades, and that the men they are now hanging were in large part the people their own policies created and then abandoned. That is not a story empires tell about themselves, not willingly, not without considerable pressure. So the head goes on the bow, the pamphlets print, the history books record a monster and a victory. The sailors in Bristol remain unemployed. The governors in weak colonies remain unfunded. The legal fictions remain useful. The pardons keep arriving late. And somewhere in that recurring distance between what power does and what it claims to do, between the pardon and the severed head, between the commission and the criminal, between the manufactured demon and the actual man, is where you find not just Blackbeard's story, but the mechanism by which societies have always managed the crises they refuse to name. You build a monster from the materials the system discards. You hunt the monster with methods the system cannot legally authorize. You display the monster's death as evidence of the system's health. Then you wait for the next treaty, the next demobilization, the next harbor full of men who know exactly how to seize a ship and have nothing left to lose by doing it.